This is the Mondoweiss podcast. I'm Dave Reed. On May 20th, the Chief Prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, filed arrest warrant applications for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and 3 senior Hamas leaders. Mondoweiss correspondent David Kattenburg called the charges against the Israeli leaders a bombshell. Khan said the 2 men bear criminal responsibility for a host of war crimes and crimes against humanity, including starvation of Gazan civilians as a method of warfare, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury in the besieged enclave, willful killing or murder, intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population, extermination by starvation, and persecution and other inhumane acts committed from at least October 8. All of these crimes form part of a widespread and systematic attack against the Palestinian civilian population pursuant to state policy. In this episode, Yumna Patel speaks with Hassan Ben Imran, a member of the Governing Council of Law for Palestine, about Palestinians' long effort to access international legal institutions and the impact of this development. Later, I speak to Spencer Ackerman, a Pulitzer Prize-winning foreign policy columnist for The Nation, about how these indictments deepen the crisis of international order.
We've just witnessed one of the most significant developments on the international stage when it comes to the genocide in Gaza and the horrific crimes that have been committed over the past 7 months. On Monday, May 20th, the Chief Prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, filed arrest warrant applications for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and 3 senior Hamas leaders, Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Leif, and Ismail Haniyeh. Joining us to speak about the ICC arrest warrant applications and the implications for both the Israeli and Palestinian leaders, as well as the future of the genocide in Gaza, is Hassan Ben Imran, a member of the Governing Council of Law for Palestine and a PhD researcher in law at the University of Galway, the Irish Centre for Human Rights, Ireland. Hassan coordinated the Genocide Prevention Emergency Action, where 30 lawyers of law for Palestine were dedicated to legal action to pursue the legal mechanisms of genocide prevention and accountability. Hassan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Yumna. It's my pleasure to join.
So I want to start off by asking you, as someone who's been involved in seeking justice and accountability for the Israeli crimes committed across the occupied Palestinian territories, not just in this genocide, but outside of it as well, what was your reaction to the news that the ICC was seeking arrest warrants for figures like Netanyahu and Gallant? I mean, this was a long time in the making.
So the first reaction was, really? Did it really happen? I was quite surprised, to be honest. We have been hearing rumors of these arrest warrants way before they were circulated in the media, but everyone was quite skeptical for why they have not been issued yet, considering that arrest warrants do not usually go through this much of ambiguity and suspense. In the Ukraine case, in other cases, the arrest warrants were issued smoothly and automatically upon establishing a reasonable ground for the existence of crimes. So my first initial reaction was positively surprised. I kind of did not believe the news until I saw the video myself, until I read it, until I started having journalists calling me to ask me to comment on this. And I was like, oh, so it's real. So then I called my colleagues. I started asking people about the technicalities, the details, because I saw it like 10 minutes later, which is quite late. So many things can happen these days. To be honest, it was a mixture of feelings. On one hand, I was happy that this finally has happened. This has been a very long process that should have taken less time. At the same time, I was I would say, confused, if I could say so, for why genocide was not included in the mandate, in the arrest warrants, why apartheid was not included, why occupation was not mentioned, why nothing that preceded October the 7th was included in the arrest warrants. I felt like, do we really need a genocide for some action to happen on the ICC, for some arrest warrants that have been expected ever since 2015? Palestine approached the court the first time in 2009. Palestine then was not a state within the GA, the United Nations General Assembly. Then Palestine got the statehood level, the non-member state in the United Nations. Then in 2015, Palestine approached the court again, and Palestine became a member of the Assembly of State Parties. And ever since, until 2021, the investigation was not initiated. Now the investigation started in 2021. until today, until a genocide took place, nothing happened. So I would say it was a mixture of feelings and thoughts, but definitely this is a step in the right direction. This is a historic step. This is something that, while it should have happened before, it's still something to be commended that it happened eventually, despite the pressure that we were familiar with.
And I want to get more into the lead up to this action that was taken by the ICC prosecutor and all the years that it's taken to get to this, as you mentioned. But before we do that, let's take a look at what happens now. So for our listeners, these aren't actual arrest warrants. So those arrest warrants still have to be approved by a pretrial chamber, to my understanding. And that's something that could take several months. So my two questions for you are, in your view, what is the likelihood that these arrest warrants are actually approved and then this moves forward into the next phase? And then if it does move forward and these warrants are issued for these leaders, what will happen? How will they be affected?
To my knowledge, there are no precedents for arrest warrants to be overruled by a pre-trial chamber.
Okay.
However, there are precedents in the Darfur case against Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, where the arrest warrants were issued quoting and citing some crimes, but not genocide in particular. And then the prosecutor at that time, Ocampo of the ICC, appealed the decision of the pre-trial chamber to include the crime of genocide to the arrest warrants. So they have been issued, they were issued at that time, but they did not cite genocide. They only cited the war crime and crimes against humanity. That was approved by the pretrial chamber, and eventually the crime of genocide was included. So we're expecting that things are supposed to go in the same usual direction where nothing is challenged. I think if any challenge needs to happen, it should be why genocide was not included in the mandate, why apartheid was not included, why the prolonged occupation was not included, why the settler violence is not included, why the settlements are not included. All of these are a matter of consensus within the international legal community, especially the settlements in the West Bank. And the list goes on. If we're not talking about apartheid, at least we're talking about an administrative practice of discrimination and racism. Yeah. So none of this was included. So all of these questions should be challenged actually at some point with further work with the court, with further pressure, including these crimes. I think eventually they will be included because the evidence or the reasonable ground for the existence of these crimes is very well established.
So let's take a hypothetical. The arrest warrant is issued. If Netanyahu or Defense Minister Gallant were then to go to one of these countries that are party to the Rome Statute, then arrest warrant would be issued for them. Let's say that they are apprehended, they are arrested in one of these cases. What happens then? Are they brought to trial? Does the investigation then take place? How long would something like that take to happen? And is there a precedent for something like that?
Yeah. So there are precedents for individuals being handed over to the court. It happened in several cases. The procedure goes like this. Any state, generally speaking, theoretically speaking, should collaborate with the court, whether or not they are members to the Assembly of State Parties, usually called the ASP. Legally speaking, it is only binding on those member states of the Assembly of State Parties. So if any of these leaders lands in a territory of a member of the ASP, they should be handed over to the court in the Netherlands, specifically in The Hague. And then the trial commences. Before that, these are allegations, accusations founded on the basis of a reasonable basis of evidence. So they are not empty allegations. They are allegations built on the basis of a solid evidence, but they're not yet convictions. They're not full decisions until the trial happens. So the trial starts the moment these leaders or some of them are handed over to the court. The trials in many cases took several years to be concluded. So it's not expected to be concluded within months, assuming that a state would hand them over. I think it was the Norwegian foreign minister yesterday that stated that they would hand over any leader that lands into their territory, regardless of which country they come from, indicating that if Netanyahu or Gallant are to land in their territory, they would be handing them over to the court in the Netherlands, where the ICC commences the investigation. So now, theoretically speaking and legally speaking, neither Netanyahu nor Gallant can land in any country, any member state of the ASP. That includes most of Europe, that includes Canada, that includes many Asian, African countries, that limits their movement a lot. If that really happens, it could be deemed as the end of the political life of those leaders. The United Nations is in Geneva and in New York. Okay, in New York they can attend because the US is not a member of the court, is not a member to the ASP, but within Europe, it will be quite complicated for them. In some cases, the court asked the countries not to allow these leaders to fly over their territory.
Okay.
So you would include the journey where they would have to fly over the US territory, because I think most of the flights would pass by Europe. And most of these European countries are members to the court. So if the law is upheld, if the procedures of the court are upheld, it is a very serious situation for those leaders.
Let's take a look at the actual charges that are being lobbied against the Israeli officials first. Starvation of Gazan civilians as a method of warfare, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury in the besieged enclave, willful killing or murder, intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population, extermination by starvation, persecution, and other inhumane acts committed from at least October 8th, all part of a, quote, widespread and systematic attack against the Palestinian civilian population pursuant to state policy. So these, of course, are serious crimes and violations of international law. But some critics, including yourself, say, this is just a drop in the bucket of crimes that Israel as a whole and Netanyahu and Gallant specifically have carried out against Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but all across occupied Palestine. And as you mentioned, some of these bigger crimes, such as genocide, apartheid, occupation, aren't included in the list. What do you make of this specific list of charges and charges that aren't included in this list?
So the charges that have been included are exactly as you call them, a drop in the bucket. These are some of the charges that could be added after October the 8th. But some of them, even if we are to start the investigation in October, the charges are much bigger. The accusations, the founded accusations, the allegations that are founded on evidence submitted by several civil society organizations, including Law for Palestine, are much bigger than that. But if we are to look at the whole situation, ever since Palestine approached the court and became a member, ratified the Rome Statute of the ICC and became a member to the ASP and the court, then we're talking about a very, very limited set of charges. A set of charges that does not convey the actual crimes that have been committed by Netanyahu himself. So there are so many other crimes that are within the mandate of the court that have very well established evidence and legal literature, including apartheid. We're talking about Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, others that have been talking about apartheid. Israeli NGOs are talking about apartheid, despite some disagreement on the scope of this apartheid, whether it includes Palestinians within Israel as well, or only Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. After all of this evidence, it poses so many questions why this set of charges was not included to the arrest warrants. After October the 8th, now we're having a case in the ICJ, the top court of the United Nations, or like the most prestigious court, as many jurists call it in the world. It's talking about a plausible case for genocide, regardless of what the former president of the chamber said in a very ambiguous comment later on, I think on the BBC. The court did specifically say that there is a risk for prejudice against the rights of the Palestinians to be protected from genocide. So there is a plausible case for genocide. In the provisional measures, I think the ones that were issued, the request for the provisional measures, the court specifically mentioned that starvation is not a risk anymore. It's settling in. This is a case for the merits. Now we're talking about something for the merit stage, not for the provisional measures. Provisional measures are an interim order that does not decide on the case or the merits of the case. And now we're expecting another provisional measure order. After all of this recognition of the risk of genocide, we're talking about other organizations, the UN, special rapporteurs, warning continuously about the risk of genocide. Some of them have confirmed it is a case for genocide. The United Nations Special Rapporteur in Palestine, Francesca Albanese, specifically detailed in her Anatomy of Genocide report how what's happening in Gaza is an act of genocide. After all this, and after all of this evidence and the intent established by several organizations, we submitted to the court close to 600 genocidal statements. Half of them are by the leaders of Israel, not by the journalists only, not by the doctors, not by the population, by the leaders, the ones who decide how the war is run in Gaza. After all of this evidence has been established, it poses so many questions for why this set of charges, why genocide is not included in the arrest warrants. So to conclude my observation on this, I would say this is a good first step. It is something that should have happened. It has happened finally. The set of crime is definitely not conclusive. It's definitely missing so many major elements, so many major crimes, but it's not too late. Procedurally, legally, there is still time to correct this mistake.
It's not just the Israeli leaders, though, that were named in this application for the arrest warrants by the ICC prosecutor. What do you make of how Israel has treated these mechanisms of international law and international accountability, whether it be the ICC, the ICJ, the UN, and how it's blocked a lot of these bodies and mechanisms at every turn over the past several years and decades?
Yeah. For Israeli leaders and the general atmosphere in Israel, these courts are some sort of a social construct. The only thing that is solid is their rights, what they perceive as the rights. They truly see Israel as an entity above the law. So to them, any entity that was created following the Second World War is a marginal entity. This is an entity that has been created for the world, for the rest of the world, not for Israel. Like, who are you in that sense to come and question me or my actions? And I'm not making this up, or I'm not even citing experts. I'm citing Netanyahu himself. Before the arrest warrants were issued, he recorded a video in his office and then released it on his social media accounts, saying that these institutions were founded to protect us. And by us, he was claiming to represent Jewish people all over the world, which I don't think is accurate. So he's saying that these institutions were founded to protect us, and now they are coming after us. Israel does not see that these institutions were created to hold them accountable. These institutions are created to protect them, to facilitate, to serve them, to help them in that sense. And this is not something related to Netanyahu. This has been the case all along Israeli political life. It included cabinets or governments created by the left, by the Labour Party, that committed several war crimes and crimes against humanity. So there is an understanding within the Israeli political elite that we are above the law. Nobody can touch us. We have the United States having our back. So whatever we do, we can get along with it. Now that the courts are coming after us, many of them are still confident that none of this would actually materialize. None of this would happen. While on the Palestinian side, the general atmosphere is that we want some accountability. We don't know how this accountability will look like. We're unsure about many of its details, but something has to happen. Gaza was supposed to be uninhabitable by 2020. Yet 2020 came, nothing happened. People continued surviving. Then the explosion happened. So we're talking about a very devastating situation, making Palestinians okay with any solutions that would come, even if they are not sufficiently just and fair.
To go further into the reaction that we've seen from Netanyahu and the US and other allies of Israel, unsurprisingly, the US, Israel, and others have responded to this ICC decision by lobbying a number of accusations, not just against the court, but also against the prosecutor Khan as well. So the US called the decision, quote, outrageous. Some Republican lawmakers have said that they were going to seek sanctions against the prosecutor. Netanyahu's come out in full force against this. He's called it anti-Semitic. He's calling Khan a rogue prosecutor. He's claiming that Israel acted with moral fortitude and has done everything possible to respect international law in Gaza. In an interview recently with CNN's Jake Tapper, Netanyahu claimed that people in Gaza aren't actually starving, as the application for arrest warrant stated. And he said that Israel has actually been sending aid into Gaza, not preventing it. He even implied that the genocide has had some positive effects for Gaza. And he said he claimed that the price of produce in Gaza has actually gone down since the start of the war. So, I mean, this sort of deflection, in addition to it being so outrageously comical in some regards, it's not unexpected from Netanyahu and from other Israeli officials, right? But when you peel back this facade of feigned indignation at these accusations and all the usual talking points from the Israeli government, are we actually seeing someone who is ultimately very concerned about what is happening, or even scared or terrified by the implications that this could have for him? I mean, you said at the beginning that this could technically spell the end of his political career or future as a political figure in Israel. So I'm curious what you think of that.
I think regardless of what Netanyahu is saying, he definitely feels the pressure. He definitely feels it's a very serious situation, unfortunately for political reasons, not reasons related to the arrest warrants themselves. I don't want to go off topic too much, but
Sure.
again, Israel knows that Israel, and again, I insist on speaking of Israel regardless of Netanyahu. Netanyahu is not the worst person we can imagine to lead the cabinet. So there is nothing new. It's just that Netanyahu is more clear. He makes it easier to quote. It makes it really easy to quote and cite, his own motivations. Netanyahu is seriously worried not about the courts taking action, but about the US feeling that he's a liability. He started to realize that the US, including Trump himself, not just Biden, like even if Trump comes back to power, Netanyahu is sensing that the US political elite, the potential candidates for presidency, are feeling that he is a liability. So if they see a substitute for him, they would be very glad to replace him. And if that happens, it's having the arrest warrants applied against him becomes a possibility. At the end, he's not leading the state anymore. Actually, it sounds very convenient for the US that Netanyahu is to be blamed for the whole thing, because this way they can continue their support for Israel. Israel can continue the genocide, whether the silent genocide or the active loud genocide, regardless of which form of genocide Israel continues with. That makes it easier for the US to continue funding Israel without having encampment in universities, on campuses, without having all of that pressure, without having 15 people behind blinking calling him war criminal. So the best way is to replace Netanyahu. Israel does feel that it is above the law. Something like excluding Gantz reinforces this idea that yes, one individual might be sacrificed, but not the whole genocidal system. So Gantz speaks better than Netanyahu. He is less right-wing than Netanyahu, at least for the international observers. He does not look as extremist as Netanyahu. While in action, he's doing the same job. Gantz is continuing with the apartheid system. Gantz would be very happy to continue this war until 50, 60,000 people are killed. Gantz never challenged any of the major violations Israel is committing. Not the settlements, not the situation in East Jerusalem, not the prolonged occupation, not starving Gaza, not the siege of Gaza. None of this has been challenged by Gantz. It's actually the opposite. None of this would have happened if Gantz decides to leave the cabinet. None of this would have happened. So yes, Israel does feel that it is above the law, and this does not come out of their own imagination. It comes from their own actual observation and their track in history with the world, that they can do something and get along with it. This has happened over and over again.
This preliminary investigation into crimes in the occupied Palestinian territories began almost 10 years ago. During that time, Gaza has been bombed a handful of times, even before this latest genocide. Thousands have been killed in the occupied West Bank. Illegal settlements have continued to expand. This begs the question, why has this taken so long? And why is the court or the prosecutor choosing to focus just on October 8th? And later, what politics are at play here at the ICC? What do you see as the reasons for these missing pieces?
So, short answer is politics.
Yeah.
Only politics can explain why this has taken 9 years. We're approaching the 10th year, actually, so we can say it's 10 years.
Sure.
The long answer, and I'll try my best not to go into legal technicalities, but the long answer is that Palestine approached the court initially in 2009, almost 15 years ago. Palestine was denied access to the court, was not able to ratify the Rome Statute, the founding document of the court, because Palestine at that time was not recognized as a state within the UN. Palestine in 2012 approached the United Nations Security Council. It failed, so it went to the General Assembly, and it became a state. A non-member state, but still it's called a state. So it's not a member because the Security Council did not approve its membership. Basically, we're talking about the US veto. But the General Assembly recognized Palestine. After that, Palestine started preparing itself to approach the court again. A few years later, in 2015, they approached the court. They lodged an application to become a member, to ratify the Rome Statute and become a member to the court, and then request preliminary investigation throughout the territory of the State of Palestine, and an investigation that includes everything within the mandate of the court. It was a very general request lodged by Palestine intentionally, so that the court applies its own regulations, its own legal tests on the situation in Palestine, and does not exclude anything. However, Palestine entered into the corridors of procedural technicalities, and this took like 2 to 3 years. So tens of applications, tens of amicus curiae submissions have been made to the court. So many states were submitting documents whether to argue that Palestine is or is not a state for the purposes of the Rome Statute. At the end, the court said, yes, Palestine is actually a state for the purposes of the Rome Statute. 6 years after it already accepted Palestine within the ASP. Like, it was very surreal, very unexplainable, inexplicable by so many legally grounds. Like, we tried to make sense of why this came 6 years after it already was admitted to the ASP. But once you remember that this legal game actually means 5 million people within apartheid system, means that people unable to go for medical facilities, basically people not living as people living as lesser humans. So these legal games decide the fate of actual humans, people living there. Even if these arrest warrants are not completely applied, nobody can deny that it exerts serious pressure and it influences the actions of leaders. But eventually it does create pressure, and this pressure saves human lives. This pressure might allow someone to go to a medical facility without which he or she would lose their lives. So we're talking about actual serious consequences of these procedural games that have been played with the State of Palestine over the course of 6 years.
Through these decades of legal proceedings and politics and biases, people are being killed. People are being subjected to brutal military occupation, to apartheid systems, and now to genocide. 40,000 at least, potentially much more, have been killed in Gaza over the past 7, almost 8 months. At the end of the day, what does this mean for Palestinians trapped in Gaza right now and are still subjected to this brutal genocide? Is there hope for justice and accountability? Is there hope for an end to this genocide through legal mechanisms such as the ICC?
When the news were circulated about this, I received a few messages from a couple of friends in Gaza. One of them is a lawyer. The other person is not someone that is interested in any legal mechanisms. Both of them were quite excited. They were not quite hopeful, but they were happy. They said, somebody is noticing that we're humans. That was the comment of one of my friends. So people in Gaza are happy about the court taking action. And I felt this mixture of feeling that I want to tell them, yes, we will continue pushing for that. Hopefully something will happen out of this. But on the other hand, another part of me was like, don't expect too much. And this is someone that has lost his house. He's separated from his wife because of the bombing. Like, she has to stay with her family. He has to stay with his family. They're trying to settle things. Like, their life is on hold, completely on hold. They're living within a simulation, a sadist simulation that they hope is going to be temporary. So I had this mixture of feeling that I couldn't explain that, yes, we should be hopeful. The court should do something. But in the same time, I was like, yeah, but there are so many obstacles. I could not express any of that. So people in Gaza are actually happy about this decision. At least that their pain is recognized. The least of it is that their pain, maybe no accountability will happen in the lifetime of Benjamin Netanyahu. Maybe. We don't know. There are many criminals out there. So many criminals. I've been to Cambodia. I've been to many countries where criminals as bad as Netanyahu have gone away with it. So that's a possibility. But at least for these victims, for people that lost their direct family members, their houses, people that are counting the days, they think that they're going to be next. This guy thinks he's going to be next. He has explicitly mentioned it. So at least they feel that their pain is recognized somewhere in a serious legal body, that their pain is recognized. But I would conclude with saying something to the audience who are listening to this, that we should not sit and wait for the court to decide justice. Justice throughout history was not decided by courts. Colonialism was legal. over the course of 100 years, 200 years. It was legalized within the League of Nations. How did the plight of Palestine start? Through the British mandate over Palestine. That was a legal mandate. Some scholars now are revising the legality of the British actions, but Britain, according to the law of the League of Nations, paved the way for all of this somehow, the government of Great Britain at that time. So we should pursue legal mechanisms. We should keep pushing. We should try to seek as much justice as possible out of them, but we should be very aware that so many unpleasant stories within human history happened within the legal mandate or happened according to the law. Colonialism is just one of them. Slavery is another case. It was a legal act. Nobody was a criminal for being a slave owner.
Well, Hassan bin Imran of the Law for Palestine organization, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Yumna.
Spencer Ackerman is a Pulitzer Prize and National Magazine award-winning journalist, foreign policy columnist for The Nation magazine, and the author of Reign of Terror, How the 9/11 Era Destabilized America and Produced Trump. He continues to cover the war on terror through his newsletter Forever Wars and is now a contributor to Zeteo News. Spencer, welcome to the Mondoweiss podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get into the impact of these new ICC indictments, can you explain what you've described as a long-standing divide between international law and what the U.S. calls its rules-based international order? And as a note to listeners, we may refer to this as RBIO throughout this discussion.
Sure. You may have heard the president, others in elite foreign policy circles refer to the phrase rules-based international order as a way of explaining America's role on the world stage, which is to say arguing for a particularly dominant role on the world stage, by virtue of explaining the benefits that this order is supposed to bring. So when the United States refers to itself as upholding the rules-based international order, it means typically something that sounds like international law, that sounds like the institutions, agreements, and general liberal internationalist architecture of international law, but they don't say international law. So given that the first words of this phrase are rules-based, it prompts the question, what rules are we talking about? And what I mean is that while the phrase evokes something that you could be reasonably mistaken in confusing for international law, it operates instead as an architecture of exceptionalism by which international law isn't replaced. Oftentimes, the way the United States operates on the world stage, particularly when it's not directly using its military power, is through the institutions, the architecture, often through the processes, sometimes even the legal processes of international law, except it doesn't accept that those international law institutions bound it, restrain it in any meaningful way, or restrain its major allies, partners, adherents, and so forth. So, for instance, oftentimes the way the rules-based international order operates is as if what America wishes to see accomplished is legal, is the natural outcome of the processes of international law. So, for instance, think about the wars the United States has launched unilaterally in Iraq or multilaterally in the Balkans in the 1990s, in Libya in 2011, and so on, that don't have the imprimatur of international law. Those aren't, sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council. Things like that. That's a circumstance in which the rules-based international order acts as the prerogatives of the United States and its major allies, as if they were international law. So it's not exactly a way of replacing international law. It's a way of carving out a pride of place for American exceptionalism within it. And I say American exceptionalism in somewhat of a way that may not always be familiar. Oftentimes we talk about American exceptionalism as referring to a kind of unique history or destiny of sorts, a kind of civic religion, whereby the United States earned its power by virtue of how good it is, or I guess to say by virtue of how virtuous it is. When I mean American exceptionalism, I mean what that story is meant to license, which is to say that America's the one that sets the rules, not the one bound by the rules. That is the fruit of American exceptionalism. We understand American exceptionalism by its deeds. Similarly, that's how I believe we ought to understand the rules-based international order as nothing more than the prerogative of the United States from a position of such preponderant power, militarily, economically, politically, that it can act outside international law, but still the rest of the world must go along with that.
Thank you. Does the Biden administration want to see the international legal system, well, not collapse based on how you've just described the rules-based international order working sort of in conjunction with it, but diminish in favor of this other thing, this RBIO that you're describing? And is there some intentionality behind how the administration is approaching these things, or do you think it's just kind of flailing about right now in its efforts to protect Israel's impunity?
I think a kind of third thing, which is that the Biden people have deluded themselves, that this is sort of a thing about liberal internationalism, into meaning not just Biden, but adherents of liberal internationalism, whereby there is no meaningful distinction between the rules-based international order and international law. So Biden wouldn't want to see the mechanisms of international law collapse because often they're useful against U.S. adversaries. I think something that we saw this week with the ICC is precisely the ways in which adherence to America and American prerogatives and American interests is what determines the way the United States views the institutions of international law, and when it views those as a hindrance to those prerogatives and interests. So, quite famously, not a year ago, the president ordered his administration to provide evidence to the ICC that would be useful in indicting Vladimir Putin for war crimes, for his illegal aggression in Ukraine. Not a hard case to use the ICC in a situation where the outcome would favor you. That is the way in which the administration would view international law. It would view it as no less legitimate because of the promotion of U.S. prerogatives and interests and so forth, to then decry the ICC as outrageous when it holds Israel to account for those same war crimes violations. That's the relationship that we see here. It's not so much flailing, it's that America has been so powerful for so long, and in particular over the past 30 years, unilaterally dominant worldwide, a new circumstance in world history, that it has told itself a kind of heads I win, tails you lose story about the heads I win, tails you lose story about the order that it's built. So if the mechanisms of international law punish those the United States seeks to punish, all the better. If it seeks to punish those like either the United States, Israel, the United Kingdom, Australia, go on down the list, then those laws and institutions are, I don't necessarily want to say illegitimate. I'm not sure that's the word they would use, but no longer taken with the weight that you or I might think of when we think of the law. The law either binds all of us or it doesn't. And we see here how the vision of the United States which is to say, setting itself out as an exception to international law, hollows out international law, makes it brittle, makes the rest of the world see this yawning discrepancy between what the United States will accept for itself and what it will impose on its adversaries, and not view international law as the illegitimate party, but instead view the rules-based international order as the illegitimate party. We got a taste of this when we saw in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, how outside of Europe, the United States was not able to sell most of the world, particularly the non-Western world, on the story that it told itself about Russia being the serial international outlaw. Because they had seen too much, go on down the line. The illegal American invasion of Iraq, any number of other such American aggressions throughout both recent and longstanding U.S. foreign policy history.
Yeah. Well, let me go ahead and ask you. I mean, the hypocrisy of the response from the U.S. and Western nations to Israel's assault on Gaza, in contrast to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which you just mentioned, it has caused nations in the global South to reassess how they relate to the global system. And now we're seeing more action from countries like South Africa, Colombia, others, to address Israel directly over its actions and crimes. You wrote in The Nation magazine that these countries have typically been on the receiving end of American power. What role do you see them playing in this struggle over, for lack of a better term, the global order?
Well, they're the people, right? They're ultimately the world is populated by people, and we're talking about most of the people of the world. And it will ultimately be they who determine the legitimacy of one system or another. And that may sometimes affect the material reality between nations and in the international arena. Sometimes it will be simply more about an approach toward the various choices that nations face when confronting large scale powers, both ascendant and extant, like in the United States. So the United States tells itself that it's entered an era of great power competition. Let's set aside the merits of that for a moment, but if it is a competition, it implies that you are competing for the allegiance of people. I don't really see how the United States would be competitive in the sense that on face value, it's pointing out when using this phrase, the longer that the Israeli genocide in Gaza exposes the degree to which the rules-based international order tells nations that have typically been on the receiving end of America and allied power that there is a different and more subordinate role for them than for the United States.
Yeah. It seems like Israel has an incentive to see the international legal system as it is now subsumed into this U.S.-centered rules-based order. Do you get the sense that people and institutions engaged in the international law realm understand these threats? How are they reacting to these moves?
The trouble with law is that it's a field made by lawyers. And so lawyers are able to tell themselves stories whereby if someone violates the rules, then self-evidently the violators are wrong. And I sympathize with a lot of that. It is much more of an aspirational picture for the world as we would like it to operate than the world that we live in. We still live in a world of power, not a world of law. And so I don't often get the sense that even as people in the international law space recognize the fragility of international law, that necessarily they look at the rules-based international order as this parasitic entity that's draining the vitality of international law, precisely because often the people who sit in these institutions are from the West and have some relationship with the United States, with the United States allies, with the rules-based international order.
So how should we understand this action by the ICC's chief prosecutor in the context of what you've been discussing here, this struggle over the international system of law and how it's relating to the U.S.-directed RBIO?
So first and foremost, when we're discussing this, we should put front and center the dire and immediate needs of the Palestinian people in Rafah, in Gaza, in all of Palestine to be free. And I feel like sometimes when we're looking at this, we can sometimes run the risk of having a very abstract discussion when what we're really talking about is what does and does not stop, what does and does not enable this massive carnage that we're seeing. That said, I don't believe that the fight over these indictments will be what ends the genocide in Gaza by the Israelis. But we are nevertheless, I think it's important nevertheless to understand this action by Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan as being an inflection point, to use a bit of a cliche, just an important moment, a moment that exposes this very often papered over divide between these two, you could say symbiotic forces, but nevertheless forces that in the unforgiving minute are competing with one another for what orders the world. And this is the first time that an entity, a government within the Western ambit, whether you want to say Israel is Western or not, it nevertheless is, bandwagons with the United States. So that's why I use the term. Sure. This is the first time that the International Criminal Court, in its somewhat 25-year-ish history, has ever gone after someone in that ambit. It's, Khan gave an interview to CNN the other day in which he said an unnamed senior official of an unnamed Western country told him that the ICC is for bad actors like Putin and for Africa. That is as bald-faced a statement of the rules-based international order as the rules-based international order is an adjunct, an agent, and an amplifier of American exceptionalism. That's simply saying the rules are not supposed to be for us and our friends. And we're recording this on a day when Matthew Akins, one of the best, I don't honestly know if he's American, but one of the best Western reporters of the war in Afghanistan, and his colleague Azam Ahmed revealed the extent of forced disappearances, torture, brutality, warlordism of a man the United States spent a whole lot of the Afghanistan war backing, promoting, funding, assisting, an infamous warlord who was assassinated several years ago named Abdul Razik. And when you read this story, a whole lot of American objections to the International Criminal Court, both this week concerning Israel and in the past, becomes a lot clearer. Because when the United States is defending Israel's impunity for war crimes, it's doing that to defend its own.
Yeah, thank you for that. Lastly, to bring it back to the U.S. a little bit closer, over the past 2 days, liberals and conservatives in the U.S. have found consensus over the ICC. Antony Blinken is eager to work with Republicans to punish the court and its employees. What do you expect them to do? There's a lot of anger in the Senate from Republicans, but plenty of Democrats as well. Do you have an idea of what they might be able to do, and what impact do you think that will have on the court?
I mean, the way that this was discussed in Congress on Tuesday suggested that they want to put together a sanctions package, which is a return to what the Trump administration did when the ICC started investigating, announced that it sought to investigate war crimes committed during the Afghanistan war, not just the United States's, but the Taliban's as well. Very reminiscent of the way that we saw Khan say, if I'm going to, apply war crimes charges to Israel, I'm also going to do it to the leadership of Hamas. And that seems to be a bit of a starting point for what it looks like Congress, with the administration's blessing, will return to. They'll surely disagree and argue about the details, but it has been striking to see both the liberal and conservative wings of the International Court come together to defend impunity for a genocide.
Spencer, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Hey, thank you so much.
That's our show. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication with no paywalls. If you would like to support our work, please go to mondoweiss.net/donate. Please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find the show. Subscribe to one of our free email newsletters so you can stay up to date on events in Palestine and related politics here in the U.S. and around the world. Finally, if you have any more feedback, send me an email at dave@mondoweiss.net. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode.